Thank you very much for the opportunity to present in front of such nice audience. Um, Remote forest or remote primary forest project is a long-term collaborative efforts of many scientists across 10 countries. Um, and I will try to show you today some highlights of our research, which are important for strengthening the conservation efforts. So for us, as foresters or forest ecologists, the primary forests are very important reference sites to assess the impacts of climate change. We all know that the climate change has a very strong impact of what's happening right now in the forests. Besides the increasing temperatures and climate extremes, the natural disturbances are increasing, and the predictions are quite worrisome. Large-scale beetle outbreaks, wind throws, fires are ongoing globally, and of course Europe is not an exception. And as we observed large-scale outbreaks in our regions, we were motivated actually to study more and better understand the primary forests as reference. So one of the main questions which motivated us to start with this research was if the present day outbreaks that we observe across the primary forests are only result of climate change, or if we can find some historical evidence about such events in the past. So the remote primary forest project is focused on mountain temperate forests. So we mostly work in 10 European countries. We established approximately 1,200 study plots and collected more than 30,000 tree cores, as dendrochronology is an important part of this project. We are interested, as I mentioned, especially in the disturbance history, in the drivers of the disturbance dynamics, and how this impacts the biodiversity and carbon accumulation in a spruce-dominated and mixed beech-dominated temperate primary forests. I guess all of you know the first primary forest map published by Francesco Maria Sabatini. Already at this map, you can see that most of these temperate primary forests are situated in the southeastern and eastern Europe. So that's where our main focus of this research is. Important part of our work is the identification of primary forests. So we spent lots of time searching for these localities, and we were actually surprised how many primary forests were still not mapped and identified. Just to show you some examples, it was also possible to find entire primary forest valleys. You can see here these beautiful drone pictures from typical Carpathian mixed fir beech spruce forests. As an example, I need to mention the Boja Valley, which is 10 kilometers long valley without the trail, without the road, where for decades, actually, most likely nobody went. Even the forest owners have never been there. So it's kind of luck to find such treasures, and it's still possible. So the problem is that still many of these primary and old growth forests are not mapped and not identified, and that's, yeah, then it's very difficult to protect them, of course. Impossible to protect them. Yeah, here are a few pictures how it looks like. So when we identified such localities, we need to come into the field, bring lots of equipment, and often we need to climb rivers or cross rivers, climb cliffs, and bring all this equipment up to these remote localities. And yeah, we stay in the forest, so we sleep weeks and weeks in the forest every season, and collect, of course, all the stem structural data. We do classical inventories of forest structures, which means tree positions, tree heights, deadwood, regeneration, tree-related microhabitats, canopy openness, and of course we collect data on the dendrochronological data using the increment borers, and using these three cores we are able then to analyze the age of the forests and the disturbance history. As I mentioned, we were able to create possibly one of the largest dendrochronological databases from temperate primary forests, which contains more than 30,000 tree cores. So it's a lot of work. It's a big teamwork. Many people are involved in this. And we use the dendrochronological tree data especially to analyze the disturbance history. We are able to reconstruct how many times the forests were disturbed by windthrows, beetle outbreaks during the past centuries. So back to the question, we were interested if these recent outbreaks that we observe, if they are only a result of climate change, or if we can see and detect signal on such events in the very past. So when we compiled the dataset from the spruce primary forests in the Carpathian Mountains, which covers countries such as Romania, Ukraine, Slovakia, and Czech Republic, we can see that there was a peak in the disturbance activity during the 19th century and very early beginning of the 20th century. And then during the 20th century, you can see there is a low activity of natural disturbances. So nowadays we are again in a period where the forests are more susceptible. So we can say that the reduced disturbance rate since 1920s, which is a potential legacy of this higher severity disturbance, which is synchronized, regionally synchronized across these different regions, is one of the main drivers of these recent wide outbreaks that we can observe. So not only climate change is the driver, we have to say that these forests experienced such events in the past, and they are well adapted to such events. I need to highlight the Făgăraș Mountains in Romania, which is probably the largest primary forest landscape in temperate Europe, still largely unprotected. What makes it so unique that you can observe different forest vegetation types in across valley systems. So you have a landscape, primary forest landscape that covers different forest vegetation types, which is very unique in Europe, because usually only fragments of primary and old-growth forest remained. And this allowed us to compare the disturbance regimes of beech-dominated and spruce-dominated forests, which was, the results were quite surprising, because you can see that the disturbances that appeared in the beech-dominated forests were almost comparable in terms of severity to the spruce-dominated forests, and they were also synchronized. So here are some examples of the natural disturbances. This is typical beetle outbreak. These are windstorm storms in mixed beech-dominated forests, some patchy disturbance in beech-dominated forests, but also larger disturbances. This is very interesting example from the Izoarele Nerei primary forest in Romania in the Semenic Mountains. The scale of this disturbance in the largest European Union primary forest is approximately 300 hectares. So yeah, you can imagine like this really big 50 meters tall trees falling down like matches. But we have historical evidence of such events. So this is the way how these forests actually work, also through larger disturbances. Again, I need to mention that primary forests are not only the old forests, as is often wrongly interpreted in many national scale definitions. Primary forests are mosaic, and they contain also young developmental phases like you can see in this picture, which resulted after natural disturbances. Primary forests are important habitats for many rare and endangered species, not only large carnivores like lynx, wolves, and bears, but also many other less visible creatures. And as we see in our data how much the disturbance history is shaping the present-day structures of the forest, we were also interested if this historical development has some impact on the contemporary biodiversity. So we collected data on multiple taxonomic groups, especially on lichens, fungi, beetles, and birds in the Western Carpathians across several primary forest stands. The dataset was very nice because we found also species that were regionally extinct. We found many critically endangered species, and of course many vulnerable species, which highlights the important role of protecting these amazing ecosystems. And after compiling this data set, we related the contemporary biodiversity patterns to the historical disturbance events. And actually, not surprisingly, we can see that these disturbances over centuries influence the current biodiversity patterns. So what we see now in the forest in terms of species composition is not only a result of some recent activities, but it's really a result of this long-term, centuries long-term impacts of the dynamics of these disturbances. The response was non-linear and varied in across the different disturbance matrices. So in these three-dimensional graphs, you can see that the total species richness is highest in the forests that were disturbed with higher severity disturbances longer time ago. But on the other hand, the red listed species richness increases in disturbances that were disturbed by lower severity disturbances approximately 150 years ago, as well as is increasing with higher severity disturbances that occurred recently. On the other hand, the functional diversity, which can be used as an indicator of ecological resilience, was highest in the 70% disturbed forest. So again, the higher severity disturbances of approximately 70% canopy area disturbed increased the functional richness in time, also with time since disturbance. One more highlight of this direct analysis of this disturbance history to the biodiversity, the total species richness increased with the disturbance frequency. So the higher was the number of disturbances during these 300 years, the higher was the proportional richness. How does it work? So, of course, the disturbance history, such as time since disturbance, severity, and number of disturbance events, and their combination impact the forest structures, which creates diverse mosaic of habitats for different groups. So different groups of species responded to different disturbance variables as well to different structures. What is important to mention that the most critical structures that impact the species compositions in the primary forests are the canopy openness, so the light in the forest, volume of deadwood, diversity and variability of deadwood, the maximum tree age, the very old trees, and also the diversity of tree-related microhabitats. All of these variables are very difficult to find in managed forests and are very typical for natural and primary forests. So the current biodiversity that we observe in the primary forest is outcome of long-term complex disturbance processes. So the disturbances are actually maintaining the high biodiversity and the biodiversity-rich forests. On the other hand, interfering with these natural processes can lead to a decline in biodiversity patterns over time. But what is the practice? What is the reality? Generally, despite all this knowledge that is rapidly increasing in the science or in the scientific world, there is still very low acceptance of natural disturbances as a management tool in protected areas. And salvage logging is the dominant driver of primary and old growth forest loss, and is a legal driver. To conduct salvage logging in remote areas, first you need to build roads, huge roads, like in this picture, often through primary and old growth forests, which cause a lot of erosion and have many other negative effects on the ecosystem, including the expansion of invasive species and so on. And as I mentioned, many of the primary forests, also the forests where we work on, the top quality primary forests that we were able to identify, are still not mapped, are still not protected. We lost already several of our study plots, for example, in Romania, namely in the Fagaraj Mountains, where also recently there are some sites that were just impacted very closely by logging activities. For long time we are communicating this problem with the authorities, but somehow it's just impossible to get these sites under protection. Here is one of the sites where just last year was occurring logging just next to our plot. So just to give you some examples, but of course Romania is not the only country. We could stay here a longer time to showcase case from every country. But here, for example, Czech Republic, the oldest strict reserve in Czech Republic with a very famous bovine primary forest, you can see that even within the strict reserve, large-scale salvage logging occurred. You see that. Slovakia, Western Carpathians, inside of the core zone of national parks, approximately 80 kilometers square of capercaillie habitats, which are mostly old growth and natural forests, were salvage logged during very, very short period. I have to stop this because I'm just recently working on a new conservation action plan for the capercaillie, which is a species for which this area was designed actually. And we can see that how these wrong management decisions and the loss of these natural habitats and old growth forests resulted not only in the fragmentation of its habitats, but already in the fragmentation that is visible on the genetic level. So we can observe in this figure, you can see every color is different genetic subpopulation. So the population was broken into 3 different subpopulations that don't communicate, and none of them is sufficiently large to be viable in long term. And it's a big question if it's still possible to restore this population while still the issue of losing their habitat is not solved. Approximately 20,000 of hectares of its suitable habitats are still not protected and are unlikely to be protected. I'm mentioning this case because these wrong management decisions and this low acceptance of natural disturbance in this particular case resulted in lost court of Slovak Republic with the European Commission. So the situation is very, very serious. Just coming back to the definitions of the primary forests. Often, of course, it's very important for us to understand where we have the best forests which have lowest impact by humans. But on the other hand, when we focus the conservation efforts only on protection of this, at the end, often small little patches of this really like top primary and old growth forests, then such conservation efforts will result in a very fragmented, protected area network. As you can see here, this primary forest became isolated within a clear-cut landscape, which for the biodiversity conservation doesn't make much sense, because the species thriving in this primary forest will be very isolated and might experience extinction depth, as we can observe it on the Capercaillie example. On the other hand, we have also good examples how the primary forest reserve should be designed. This is Ticha and Kłoprowa Valley, where the primary forests contain some of the oldest pines that can exceed 1,000 years, some of the oldest pines of Carpathians. But again, they are relatively small patches. But in this case, the entire valley system was protected. And here we can observe that the primary forests really serve as source populations, and the previously managed forests, here with the blue color, that's a natural disturbance. It's a windthrow and bark beetle outbreak combination that introduced heterogeneity in the previously managed and homogeneous forests. It increased the amounts of deadwood, light, and the structure is very complex. And we can observe how some of the primary forest species already now migrate and colonize these previously homogeneous managed forests. This is also true for the tree species such as Pinus cembra. It's coming down to the lower elevations. So we can see also transfer from this pure spruce monoculture to more mixed and resilient forests through natural processes, through rewilding. We also analyzed the impact of natural disturbances on the trade-offs between forest biodiversity and carbon. And of course, the disturbances introduce quite significant trade-offs in these two functions. But at the larger scale, the trend is opposite. We observed high co-benefits in terms of carbon and biodiversity across larger landscapes. So protecting the large areas of forest landscapes will maintain not only the biodiversity, but also the long-term carbon storage, especially in the times with increasing disturbance severities and frequencies. So just to conclude this, natural disturbances such as windthrows and beetle outbreaks are natural parts of forest dynamics, and they maintain the critical habitat structures for forest communities. Conservation of primary forests and old-growth forests is still slow. Many forests are not mapped, not protected, and of course the conservation of only primary forests is not sufficient to achieve biodiversity conservation goals. So we really need to focus on larger landscapes, on valley systems, on processes. We as scientists, we believe that the only way, because we are still living in times when we are losing the old growth forests, while we know we need to restore them. So the situation is very bad. So we believe implementing logging moratorium on areas that potentially harbor old growth forest would be a solution, while all the process of mapping and conservation can follow. So thank you very much for attention.
So you showed the patterns of the disturbances. You showed that in the 19th century, the intensity increased. Could you comment on the reasons behind it, why there was such a pattern increasing in the 19th century and then going down? And I haven't seen, the graph was not going into the 20s, or like it was not going to the 21st century. So how does it compare to the intensity of disturbances now? And I know that it's like many layers of the question. But also, do you know of any studies attributing the disturbances nowadays to the climate change? So how much of it, of the disturbances that we observe now, would happen if it can be for climate change, and how much of it could be attributed to climate change?
This is a very complex question, but the peak in the disturbance activity in the 19th century was mostly related to the age structure of the forests. So this is how this forests work. Uh, when the trees reach certain age, they are more susceptible to the disturbances. So that's why there are these cycles that we actually can see. We did not relate this historical disturbance to the present day mortality. That's what we are working on right now. So we are revisiting every plot already third times to get the mortality data from this forest. So this will be a new study. Um, but it's obvious that the mortality is going on, and the forests again have the age structure because more than 60% of the trees are older than 120 years in this forest that we studied. So these forests are really susceptible to the disturbance. Of course, how much the climate change is speeding up this process, that's a good and important question, and I think it will be uh, topic for next studies.
Okay.
But what we can say now that is not the only driver. Yes,
Thank
the
you.
age structure is very important driver that was not considered in many other studies.